This is For Keeps With You. Baxter Boys, Book 5. Written by Jessie Gussman. Performed by Jay Dyess. Episode 4, Chapters 11 through 13. Chapter 11. Dusty surveyed the parking lot as Roland opened her door. He lowered a hand. She stared at it a minute before grasping it. She could get herself out of the car. She should get herself out of the car. But she allowed him to help. There was something nice about having someone to take care of one. Not that she'd ever felt that before, other than her friends, who were great, but they had families of their own now. And Dusty felt more guilt than anything when they took time from their families to help her. She should have her own family. Tucker walked up. He seemed a little surprised at the warm smile Dusty gave him. "Does this place have food?" "We just ate breakfast," Dusty said. Tucker took after their side of the family with his slender build, although he was tall with broad shoulders. "That was an hour and a half ago." "Didn't anyone tell you you're not a teenager anymore?" "I ate like this through college, and I know everyone says I'll regret it someday, but not today. I'm starved. You guys want anything?" "Not for me right now. Maybe later. If I remember right, this place has a homemade soup stand that's pretty good, along with all the other typical food." "Got it. You?" Tucker asked Roland. "I'll eat when the lady eats," Roland said. Dusty almost rolled her eyes, but Roland's face was serious, and it made her feel treasured somehow that he was adjusting his schedule to hers. "Good for you." Tucker grinned and strutted off, garnering more than 1 second look from the ladies milling around the lot. "I guess he could have stuck with us and hoped that one of us paid his way in. He's not a leech anyway," Roland said. "No, I talked with him a little this morning. I actually think he's a nice guy. For a bank loan officer." "He's a loan officer?" Roland asked in surprise. "He seems so young." "Yeah, that was my reaction too. His dad treats him like a little kid." Dusty looked out over the full parking lot and breathed in the hot summer air. The sky was an amazing shade of blue with not a cloud in sight. The mountains sat in the distance like guards, keeping watch. The buzz of the bike motors as they made their practice rounds mingled with the sound of the announcer and the crowd of happy people spending a relaxing day out with their friends and family members. The whole atmosphere brought back every memory from her early childhood of happy times they'd spent at the track. It was really the only time her dad made time for her. He made sure she never missed a race or practice, and no expense was too big. "Miss it?" Roland questioned her as they made their way between the long rows of cars toward the gate. "Oh yeah." She smiled, a little sad. "I don't think I've ever been at a race just to watch. You have no idea how much I wish I had my bike here." The urge to be out on the track, racing with the other competitors, was almost overwhelming. "No bad memories?" Roland asked suspiciously. She thought for a second. "You mean from the accident?" "Yeah." "Nope. It happened right after the start. So maybe my first race. I don't even think then it will be a problem. I've started so many times and nothing happened. I just don't think I'll let one bad start overshadow all the great ones I had." "That's a great attitude. I've seen so many people who think the exact opposite." "I'm a natural optimist." "About racing?" "Definitely. I always think I'm going to win." She gave him a cheeky grin. "I usually do." He smiled along with her, and she realized that some of the reason the day seemed so bright and her spirit so happy was because she was with someone she cared about. Not that she didn't care about her mechanics, Adam and Derek, and the guys she knew, riders and workers alike. But Roland was different. Better. She loved his straightforward honesty and how it was important to him to keep the line between them drawn. "Hey, Dusty!" A tall, skinny fellow shouted across the parking lot, waving to a group of people walking toward the ticket booth. "Hey, guys, it's Dusty!" Dusty braced herself. She didn't realize she squeezed Roland's hand until he squeezed back. She glanced up, and he was looking down at her in concern. "I'm fine," she said reassuringly, either for him or herself. The competitor in her didn't want to show weakness. She already had to overcome the fact that the guys wanted to treat her differently because she was a girl. Now she'd been injured. It could change things, although this group was just family and friends of some of the other competitors. But all her worry seemed in vain. A few in the group asked how she was doing, and a couple of them wanted her to sign things like a hat or a t-shirt, which was normal, although Roland gave her a strange look when she took a Sharpie and scribbled her name while the guy was wearing it. "Thanks!" The kid was probably still in high school, and he wore a smile a mile wide. She handed the Sharpie back to his girlfriend. "Anytime." "How soon are you going to be racing again?" Someone asked for what seemed like the 1,000th time, although she was sure she'd be asked that question a lot more before the day was over. "I don't know. Soon, I hope." Beside her, Roland stiffened. She gave him a curious look. It wasn't like she said next week or anything. She would listen to the doctor. If he wanted her to take another month or so off, she would. It would completely ruin her chances of winning the championship, but hey, she wanted to heal properly. And, she realized, she wanted to make Roland happy. It was an odd realization, and she definitely wanted to spend some time examining that thought. Later. More people recognized her and greeted them while Roland paid for their tickets and they walked through the gate. He kept a hold of her hand, and she didn't let go either. Several people who knew her well gave them an odd look, and Dusty smiled to herself. She'd never been with a man at the track before. "Hey, Dusty!" She turned, recognizing Gary Jensen, mechanic for Cody Kurtz, one of the other bikers who had been in the accident with her. Her stomach cramped, and she tightened her grip on Roland's hand. "Gary, how's it going?" "It's going great for us." Gary, thin, wiry, and short, had to tilt his head up to look her in the eye. "With you being out, Cody's the points leader. We couldn't be happier where we are in the standings." "That's great." Dusty tried to mean it. After the crash, she'd gone to the hospital, and Cody had picked his bike up and gone on to win the race. "Derek's been turning wrench for us." Gary drew a fry out of the container he carried and put it in his mouth. He spoke around it. "You already knew that, though." Actually, she hadn't. Both of the guys who worked as her mechanics had visited her in the hospital, and she'd informed them that it would be weeks before she was back. She couldn't blame them for wanting to do what they loved. But Derek went to Cody? It felt like she had hot wire wrapped around her chest. Beside her, Roland shifted, like he could feel her pain. "We're going to find our seats," she said. Gary's eyes shifted to Roland, then down to their joined hands. His eyes twitched, like he hadn't realized they were together before. "I didn't know you had a boyfriend." Dusty moved against Roland's side and dropped his hand so she could slip her arm around his waist. He understood exactly what she needed and wrapped his arm around her shoulder, dropping a kiss on the top of her head. He held his right hand out to Gary. "I'm Roland, and yeah, Dusty's been with me for a while." Gary took his hand. "Gary." He looked Roland up and down. "Dusty's a handful. It's going to be hard to keep up to her. It's not a competition. I like watching her fly. Gary's brows pulled in, like he couldn't understand what Roland had said. Dusty smiled. She couldn't have written a script for him any better. Gary scratched his nose, then shoved another fry into his mouth. Yeah, whatever, he mumbled. Maybe we'll run into you later. Roland gave a short wave as he put pressure on Dusty's back and guided her toward the rows of seating. Thanks, she said as soon as they were out of earshot. It was nice of him to ask how you were. She laughed. Surely you know guys don't do that. He squeezed her shoulder. I do. You're different. I don't live and breathe bike racing. I've been trying to avoid it since my accident, so it's partly my fault if people don't know how I am. Right after my accident, I tried to watch videos and people would call and come and... Her voice trailed off. She swallowed. Roland stopped and faced her. His hand cupped her cheek. The noise of the track and the people around them faded away. I get it. I can see you're an all-or-nothing kind of person. You're either all in or you can't be in at all. She stared into his eyes, so clear and green, and realized he was right. She'd always been like that, but she'd never thought about it, never realized it. It was true, though, and that's why she had such a hard time having anything to do with racing since getting hurt. She couldn't be all in, so she'd put it out of her mind. Is there a cure for that? She asked with a small smile. He snorted. Maybe you'll moderate as you grow old, but there's nothing wrong with burning hot. His hand slipped down to hold her neck under her ponytail. I kind of like it. She put both hands on his waist. Then I won't try to change. No. His voice had dropped, and it sent shivers up her spine. Don't ever change. As though he remembered where they were, he took a small step back and grinned, breaking the spell that had fallen between them. Except this. He lifted her ponytail. I dream about how you'll look with your hair down. Her eyes grew wide. She blinked. You do? You're beautiful now in jeans and a t-shirt, with your hair in a ponytail, and that's probably the way it should stay, because I don't think I could take my eyes off you if your hair were down. Her heart lifted like a bike going over a jump, and she could barely breathe. His eyes closed part way. I shouldn't have said that. Is it true? Every word, he breathed. You've never even seen me in anything nice. I want to see your hair. His hand fisted in her ponytail. But everything I admire about you is in here. His finger touched her chest just under her collarbone. Your drive and determination, your easy smile, the way you never complain, how you've overcome your family and made beautiful friendships. She put her finger on his lips. It made her uncomfortable for him to go on, complimenting her. It wasn't something she was used to. Thanks, she said. It definitely gave her confidence, though. Coming here, seeing all the racers and crew and fans she knew, having them see her weaknesses had been every bit as hard as she'd figured it would be. But having Roland by her side had been a bonus and blessing she hadn't been expecting. Hey, you two! Tucker came up beside them, holding a monster soda in one hand and a massive bucket of fries dripping in cheese in the other. Have you found seats yet? Roland eyed the fries. Not yet. He glanced at Dusty. Would you like a drink or something to eat before we sit? Dusty nodded. This way. She turned, her heart full of all the things she wanted to tell Roland, and led the way to the concessions. Chapter 12. Tucker sat on Dusty's left, and Roland settled down on her right. He enjoyed seeing Dusty and Tucker talking and laughing. Dusty's family had not done right by her, but no family was perfect. He was glad Dusty didn't seem to hold it against them. She took the occasional fry out of Tucker's bucket and munched. Roland had his arm around the back of her seat, with his hand resting on her shoulder. She felt warm and alive under his hand, and he loved the fact that he had the right, if only for today, to touch her. He'd been pretty busy building his career, working hard on developing the reputation of being the best physical therapist he could be, and hadn't thought much about settling down with a wife, kids. He looked at Dusty. She probably hadn't thought much about it either. Definitely, she wasn't ready to settle down. Not if she was still working on winning a motocross championship. He looked at the diamond hole flooring in the bleachers. She was going to be devastated when the doctor told her she would never race again, unless she determined to prove him wrong. Either way, it was going to be a hard time for her. He needed to be around to support her. But he had to be careful. He was walking a fine line, one that his supervisors would not appreciate if they found out about it. He pushed that thought away. They were here, and he wasn't going to think about the work implications. There was a chance he could run into someone who knew what he did for a living, but more than likely, they wouldn't know that Dusty was under his care. If they did, they would assume he was taking advantage of her. Was he? He removed his arm from behind her seat. She was laughing at something Tucker said, but turned immediately toward him, questions in her eyes. He smiled and took her hand. Her face lit up in response. Yeah, he wasn't going to worry about tomorrow or his work implications. Dusty would be offended if anyone suggested he was taking advantage of her. That was good enough for him. "We're not going to be able to see the whole race from here, are we?" he asked as she munched another of Tucker's fries.
Nope. In Supercross, the races are held inside of a stadium, and you can see the whole thing. It's a different paced environment and slightly different skills, but similar enough that most riders, me included, can do this in the summer and Supercross in the winter.
Racing year-round?
Yep.
Her teeth flashed, and there was no mistaking the competitive gleam in her eye. She couldn't wait to get back to racing. It was obvious. "So you never take time off?" Tucker asked from her other side.
Doing this for me is like someone else having a year-round vacation. It's fun, and I happen to be good enough to make a decent living at it.
For the first time, Roland wondered what she made. He assumed she lived in her parents' house and used at least some of their money, but she had mentioned graphic design, and now he knew she was making a living racing motocross. How much? Tucker wasn't as reticent. She named a figure that made Roland blink. Twice. Tucker whistled. "All from winning?" She laughed.
No, not at all. Winning doesn't pay a whole lot most of the time. Where I really make my money is endorsements. I'm a spokesperson for a few products. Not huge like other pro sports, but obviously enough to live on and invest.
And you do graphic design on the side?
I've actually picked up a lot of that since my accident.
She looked out over the track before looking back at him.
I seem to be good at that, too. Website design for small businesses, especially. But I've also done some logos and a few things with my motocross contacts, including bike decals and several helmets.
Roland sat, a little stunned. What Dusty had just said opened up a whole new side of her that he hadn't seen before, hadn't even considered might exist. People might have thought it was a little irresponsible of her to risk her health and life on a bike race. But the fact that she'd been working on the side to get her graphic design business going and still was making money from her endorsements made her seem like a serious businesswoman. He had to admit, he'd not seen that coming. "Your graphic design is freelance?" Tucker asked. Even Tucker seemed to have changed from the skinny young daddy's boy into a serious businessman.
"Yes, I built a website and I have a few ads, but it's mostly been word of mouth and winning bids of jobs."
"What about you, Roland?" Tucker asked with a straight face. Roland jumped a little. He hadn't been participating in the conversation, but was still trying to wrap his head around the fact that Dusty was a lot more than she seemed. "What do you mean?" "Have you ever considered going out on your own?" "As a therapist?" "Yeah." Tucker's serious blue eyes studied him. "Dusty was just telling me that you're considered one of the best, and that people actually drive for a long way to come to your group asking for you." That was true. He'd worked with several prominent business people from different states, along with various pro athletes. "Owning my own business is a dream, but there's a lot of skills that go into running a therapy group that I either don't have or don't have time to learn." Tucker nodded thoughtfully. At that moment, he looked every bit like a top-tier banker. He should get out from under his dad's shadow more often. He seemed to grow up fast when he did. Dusty picked the last fry out of Tucker's container. "Hey, that was my last fry." Dusty bit it in two. "Want the other half?" He laughed. "No, really, that's too kind. I'll go get more." Dusty checked the time. "You've got about 10 minutes. "I'll be quick." Tucker got up and shuffled down the row. Roland put his arm around Dusty. She snuggled into him. He pulled her closer. She dropped her head on his shoulder, and he kissed the top of her head, breathing deeply and closing his eyes.
"Roland Bryant, you found another distraction?"
Roland's eyes popped open. Abigail stood several seats down, a carton with burger and fries in one hand, a soda in the other. Dusty's head moved from his shoulder. His hand tightened on her arm, but he felt her stiffen. What was Abigail doing here? "I thought you had tickets to a ball game."
"I would have if you'd said yes, but when you didn't want to, I came here instead. My cousin Cody races. I guess he's pretty good."
Dusty froze under his arm. Abigail's eyes flicked between them, widened, and then her accusing gaze seared his.
"You're dating a client? That crap about a distraction and honesty and whatever was all that? Just crap."
She lifted her hand like she was going to throw her drink on him. He clenched his jaw but did not defend himself. To deny was to go back on what he'd told Dusty they would do today. He and Dusty weren't dating, not technically, but he couldn't honestly deny that he had feelings for her.
"What? You're not even going to defend yourself?"
His lips flattened, but he still didn't move. Not to defend, not to deny. There was no way he could do either. Abigail's eyes slid to Dusty. She took a small sip from her soda.
"I think," she said with narrowed eyes, "I think there are some people in our office who would be very interested to know where you're spending the day."
Dusty interjected.
"I'm not a patient at that office, and I haven't been for 2 weeks." "I'm not sure that matters."
Abigail's eyes went to Dusty's brace.
"Are you telling me Roland hasn't been giving you therapy sessions for the last 2 weeks?"
Dusty's mouth snapped shut. Abigail's mouth curved up.
"That's what I thought."
She took another sip of her soda.
Interesting."
She shifted, then started to walk away.
"Well, Roland, I'll see you on Monday. Maybe."
She laughed. Roland nuzzled Dusty's head. Dusty kept her eyes glued on Abigail until she disappeared into the crowd. Her head flew around.
Do you think she's going to try to get you fired?
His mouth touched her temple. He placed a small kiss there. I don't care. Her head tilted up.
But you could lose your job.
He nuzzled her cheek. So?
Roland, what's wrong with you? This is serious.
He touched the corner of her lips with his mouth. He knew it was serious. He could lose his job, and worse, his reputation. Everything he'd been trying to avoid. But Dusty had stood up for him. She hadn't believed Abigail's insinuations, and she'd defended him. He'd liked it. His heart beat fast against his ribs. He pulled her closer. I'm being serious. His lips brushed the side of her mouth as he spoke. Her eyes scanned his face. Her furrowed brows lifted and her eyes widened. Then they lowered. She moved her head a fraction, and their breaths mingled. Her hand came up to his shoulder, sliding over it, leaving a trail of heat behind.
This is an interesting time for you to decide you want to make out,
she whispered with a smile. I don't want to make out. It's way more serious than that.
Oh?
Her lips grazed the skin of his cheek. His eyes lowered. I can't really kiss you here, though. He took a breath, rubbing his cheek along hers before kissing her temple again. I guess you'll have to owe me. He grinned.
Or you owe me,
she retorted. We can fight about it. I'm up for that.
Where did Roland go, and who is this guy who replaced him?
She asked, her hand trailing over his shoulder and down his chest. He put his hand on top of hers, stopping it over his heart. Maybe I'm just now figuring out how amazing you are. He laughed, and they separated. Maybe I just realized how amazing I'm not. If Abigail goes in and tells Mary who I was with and what I was doing, then I might be unemployed. Not exactly a great catch.
Maybe I'm just looking for a good time and don't really care about catching anything.
Dusty tossed her head. Roland's heart dropped. He suspected it, but that wasn't what he wanted to hear. I'm back. Tucker stepped into the row. I bought you your own fries, since your pretend date doesn't seem to have any manners. He handed a boat of fries dripping in cheese to Dusty. She told me she didn't want any. Roland leaned the rest of the way back in his seat and tried hard to keep the light conversation they'd been doing so well with. He didn't want Dusty knowing that his heart was angling for more from her than just a good time for now. He wasn't even going to think about the job situation.
Hey, I'll be right back.
Dusty stood up.
That's Richard's sister. He was the other racer in the accident with me, and I don't have his number, and he hasn't posted on social media. I want to go talk to her for a minute.
By the time she was done talking, she'd gotten out of her seat and headed down the stairs. She took the fries with her. Sorry, man. Tucker grinned. Maybe she just wanted them for herself. Roland laughed. He was liking Tucker more and more. They chatted until Dusty came back up the steps. He elbowed Tucker. Her fries are gone. Tucker laughed and moved over so Dusty could sit between them. What'd you find out? Roland asked.
He quit racing. I knew he'd broken a leg, but one of his ribs punctured a lung, and he's still struggling to even breathe.
She sighed.
His sister's here because her boyfriend is racing, but Richard's accident shook their whole family up. Her parents refused to come.
I can see why. Roland hadn't flown since the day he pulled Janice from the wreckage. Not because he thought airplanes should be banned or anything, but because he didn't want to deal with them himself. If he couldn't drive, he wouldn't go. He totally understood where Richard's family was coming from.
She's trying to talk her boyfriend into not racing anymore.
But he won't. Dusty's eyes were on the track where the bikes were lining up to start.
No, she said she'd threatened to break up with him if he wouldn't quit.
Dusty sighed deep and long.
I didn't know how to tell her that.
Her voice trailed off. It wasn't her decision to make?
Yeah, I guess.
The two turned into a one. Dusty's fingers tightened on her empty fry container. Roland reached over and took her hand. She laced her fingers with his, her eyes never leaving the racers. They watched in silence as the gate dropped and the bikers sped forward in a blast of noise and dust. Each biker vied for position. The race was a lot more physical than he'd expected. One guy did clip another, and they both dropped, but they jumped right back up and restarted their bikes. The leaders hit the first jump, going airborne with a shrill scream and disappearing over the humps of dirt.
It's hard to get a lot of spectators here because you really can't see the whole race. People lose interest.
I see. That's probably not a problem in Supercross?
No, but you can't get as much air under your jumps, can't build up as much speed, and it's just not as exciting. Still, it's better than football.
Roland grinned but didn't answer. What he'd seen so far hadn't convinced him to give up his Sunday afternoon habit, but he supposed he could be persuaded. The rest of the race went by in a similar fashion. They staggered the start, so by the time all the racers were moving, there were bikes going across in front of the stands on a fairly regular basis. As the race went on, Dusty happily answered their questions and gave some commentary about some of the riders. Tucker had been right, and his dad called, so he cut out early. The late evening light was fading by the time Roland walked beside Dusty back to his car, and they drove home. Chapter 13. It was late and the house was dark when they pulled up the drive. Roland parked and started to get out. Dusty put her hand on his arm, feeling his biceps flex under her fingers.
You don't have to get out. It's late, and I'm sure you're tired.
He laughed. I'm not just going to throw you out the door and drive away. Plus, you owe me. Her eyes widened. He grinned and got out. He opened her door, and she took his proffered hand. You've got to be sore, he said. Every bone in her body ached, and it was hard to walk without a very pronounced limp.
I'm glad you didn't let me go without my braces. If I feel this awful after wearing them, it would have been worse with them off, I think.
I'm sure of it. He took her hand, his fingers sliding into hers. A cool night breeze blew across the yard, bringing with it the scent of honeysuckle and cut grass. She shivered. He slid his arm around her. Cold?
No.
Scared? She smiled in the dark.
I would never admit it.
He stood with her in front of the front door. The moon shone down, putting his eyes in shadow but showing the upturn of his lips. Thank you for being my girlfriend today.
I had a great time. Anytime you need a girlfriend, I'm in.
Her heart beat faster. That was a major hint. She felt exposed. Both of his hands came up and cupped her cheeks, warm against her cool flesh. He swallowed. I just realized today how much I need a girlfriend. He paused, shaking his head. No, that didn't come out right. He breathed out and tried again. I just realized today how much I wanted you to be my girlfriend. Would you consider it?
I told you I'm in.
I might not have a job.
I don't care.
I might have to hide our relationship for a bit.
I don't care.
She moved her cheek against his hand.
Wait, how long is a bit?
If I don't get fired, until you're no longer in therapy.
I could just get another therapist.
It seemed like an easy solution, except,
Would that go against you?
it's recorded. Anytime someone switches from one to another, it's not supposed to be a black mark, but it is. He rubbed her cheek with his thumb. No one's ever dropped me before. Besides, he bent down, touching his forehead to hers. I really don't want anyone else doing your therapy. His face showed his struggle.
You are the best.
He let out a sigh that was more like a groan. I don't think you're going to find anyone else who cares more about your recovery than me. He studied his hand on her cheek. I'm struggling with this because I want you to have the best possible care. I know how devastating it can be when your therapist screws up.
You've done it?
She asked in surprise. I've seen it.
Oh.
She didn't want him to drop his hand from her face. She leaned into it.
It could be a year, though.
He nodded. She hated the struggle that she saw going on behind his eyes.
Let me make this easy for you. If you don't do my therapy, I quit.
His lip pulled back. Don't be ridiculous.
I'm serious. I only want you. I know you feel like you have to quit because of our relationship, or whatever it is, but I'm not a victim, and you're not taking advantage of me. I'm a rational adult, and I want you as my therapist. You or nobody. That's my final word.
His eyes narrowed. Let's give it 2 months. After that, you should be down to once a week, if that, and well on the way to full recovery. She was pretty sure he had just agreed to be her boyfriend, in secret, for the next 2 months. But maybe it was just that he'd be her therapist for 2 months? She wasn't sure, and she was tired. They could straighten it out in the morning.
So I can kiss you now?
She said, stepping closer. He met her halfway, his hands moving from her cheeks to around her waist. You mean I get to kiss you?
We get to fight about it, remember?
I kind of like the anticipation. Maybe that's actually a good idea.
It could end up being a draw.
She slipped her hands up his back, feeling the ridges of muscles. It could, and I could go home without a kiss.
I could go to bed without one too,
she said with a little pout. That's sad, for both of us. Can't we compromise?
It's kind of unromantic to count to 3.
Their lips were almost touching, and she was enjoying their banter. She didn't really want to stop. We could wake Tucker up and have him count.
That's even more unromantic.
Wow, we haven't even been a couple for 2 minutes, and she's already complaining that I'm not romantic enough.
He's already fighting with me.
How about I just give in and let you kiss me?
No, I'll give in. You kiss me.
Spend the afternoon with me tomorrow, and you've got yourself a deal.
That's your pickup line. You've got yourself a deal? Really?
Shut up and kiss me. He lowered his head, and she raised hers, and she never really was sure who kissed who, but it felt like the perfect end to a beautiful day spent with the man she was afraid she was falling for. She tightened her grip on his waist, pushing closer, needing something solid as her mind whirled and exploded into colors. Her body buzzed, and when he groaned, pulling her tighter against him, heat burst in her stomach and ripped out through her fingers. Her knees shook, and her toes curled inside her shoes. He lifted his head just a bit, and they stared at each other. It was several long moments before he spoke. "If you would have told me how good you were, I wouldn't have fought you. Kiss me any time." She smiled.
I think you get the credit for that one.
"We could share it."
We'll have to. It wasn't anything that I did. It had to be you.
"Not me," he grunted. "I guess it's two halves got together and made an explosion." She laughed. He kissed her forehead and backed away. "I'll see you tomorrow afternoon?"
Yes.
Roland went home with a smile on his face. He slept with one and woke with one. He was still smiling when he stopped on Dusty's drive the next day. It faded when she came hobbling out, chewing on her lip. He jumped out of the car, his heart in his throat. Had she changed her mind? "What's wrong?"
I just got a text. Riley had her baby a bit ago, and I know I said I'd spend the afternoon with you, but I really need to go see her.
No one was more shocked than himself by the next words that came out of his mouth. "Can I come?" Her brows shot to her hairline.
You want to?
He shrugged, like it was no big deal. He hated hospitals, and he'd said as much to Dusty. "Why not?" She blinked.
I don't know. I guess I assumed you wouldn't think it was very fun to head to the hospital and see a newborn. They're usually not very pretty.
She tilted her head down.
And you said you hated hospitals.
Maternity wards were not the same as the trauma floor. He could do it. The smell would give him the shivers, but he could handle it. "It's a girl?"
A boy.
"I'd hope he wasn't pretty." She snorted.
You don't mind?
He walked closer and put his arms around her, lowering his head. "Whatever you're doing, I want to do it with you." He bent down, touching his lips to hers, careful to pull back almost immediately. It wouldn't look very good on his part if he spent the next hour standing in her driveway, kissing her. She was smiling when he lifted his head.
I'll take more.
He laughed. "Are we going to go see a baby, or are we going to stand here and kiss? Because I can tell you which one I'd rather do." She tilted her head.
I think we'd better go.
"Good choice." It didn't take long to get to the hospital. As he suspected, the smell brought back all the old feelings, but the years had sanded off the edge, and it only made him slightly uncomfortable. Nothing he couldn't handle. He supposed, if he wanted to, he could go back as a pre-med student, but he loved his chosen career and had no desire to leave it. The maternity ward was on the second floor. Dusty made a beeline to the gift shop. He allowed her to lead. "You seem to know your way around."
I've been here for Cassidy, and Harris, and Kelly, twice.
He studied her face. She didn't seem upset that all her friends were busy with husbands and babies and she wasn't. Or she did a good job of hiding it. But not every woman longed for a family. Funny how he'd never noticed that he didn't have much of one until Dusty.
What do you think of this?
She asked, pointing to a pair of glass shoes holding a bunch of blue and yellow flowers. 3 blue balloons waved above the shoes. He shrugged. "Looks good to me. You seem to be the expert." She picked it up, taking it to the counter to pay. Again, her face gave nothing away. He carried the flowers, the balloons waving past his face as she led him to the elevator. They were the only ones on, and he put his arm around her, pulling her close. "Want me to wait in the waiting room?" She lifted her face, her brows drawn.
"I was trying to figure out a way to explain why you're with me."
He couldn't help himself and leaned down, kissing her lips. She smiled and put her arms around his neck.
"Maybe they won't ask."
He kissed her again, a little longer than before. "Maybe I'll become invisible when the elevator door opens." The bell dinged and they stepped apart. She adjusted the ribbon on the flowers.
"We said we would be a secret. I don't want you to get in trouble."
He didn't want to get in trouble either, not in any more than he already was. But he didn't want to leave her. "We're friends, aren't we?"
"Yes."
"Okay then, that's what we'll say."
"They're not going to believe that's all we are."
"So?" She nodded.
"Okay."
They stepped off the elevator, and Dusty led the way down the hall. She waved at the nurses and called a greeting.
"This is their room,"
she said to him before she knocked on the open door.
"It's Dusty, and I have Roland with me. Can we come in?" "Dusty, come on in."
Riley's voice sounded a little hoarse but very happy, and Roland followed Dusty into the room. Ben Baxter sat sprawled out in the uncomfortable-looking hospital chair, a small, tightly wrapped bundle lying on his chest. Roland didn't know this Baxter brother as well as Tough, Turbo, and Torque, but he had the same deep brown eyes, and his large, calloused hands looked just as odd holding the tiny baby as Roland remembered Tough's and Turbo's looking. Dusty went straight to Riley, bending over the hospital bed and hugging her.
"Congratulations,"
she said softly, with a huge smile.
"Thank you."
Riley's smile couldn't get any bigger, although there was no missing the lines of fatigue around her eyes.
"He was 9 pounds.
Dusty glanced over at the sleeping baby and his dad.
"Oh my, he's so big." "Well, he was late, so that's probably why."
Riley glanced at her husband.
"I think Ben will give him up so you can hold him for a minute. He was going to go grab a bite to eat and bring me back a cold water. You can hold him while he's gone if you want." "I'd love to,"
Dusty said. Ben shifted. Roland set the flowers down on the windowsill.
"You guys know Roland, don't you?" "Sure. We've seen him at the shop, and he's helped with the kids at Kelly's Center while I was volunteering,"
Riley said. Dusty nodded. Ben unfolded from the uncomfortable-looking chair and carefully handed the baby over. He kissed his wife's forehead, and they spoke low before he came around and shook Roland's hand. "Glad to see Dusty has a man. She's a good girl." "We're friends." Ben snorted. "Okay." He grinned and, with a last look at his wife and son, walked out. Roland stood against the wall, watching Dusty as she held the baby and smiled down at him, while Riley gave an overview of their long night and the delivery. Dusty knew all the questions to ask, and she seemed knowledgeable about labor, delivery, and newborns. Watching her hold the baby did odd things to his heart, but her face was serene, and he could detect no longing or jealousy, just pure happiness for Riley and adoration for their new son. Finally, the baby started to stir and stretch, and Riley looked at the clock hanging on the wall.
"I guess it's feeding time." "I'll give him back to you. I'm sure Roland is ready to go."
Riley looked at him.
"Do you want to hold him? The nurse said to wait until he was good and awake before I tried to feed him."
Panic crept up Roland's throat, burning like acid. "He might cry."
"I'll take him if he does,"
Riley said with a smile. He would have said no. He was going to say no. But there was something on Dusty's face as she held the baby and waited for him to speak, a softening in her expression. Roland swallowed. "I'd love to hold him for a minute." Dusty's brows raised, but she stood. He came closer, his palms sweating. Like the little wrapped bundle was as delicate as a newly spun cobweb, Roland put his arms out and carefully helped Dusty transfer him from her arms to his. The baby was lighter than he expected and warm. He stared down into his little monkey face and felt his heart twist and shift. Something so tiny and defenseless, trusting him to protect him, made the weight of responsibility fall like a heavy yoke around his shoulders. It should have felt stifling, but instead, it felt strangely right. A longing rose in him, like a lone wolf's cry at the moon, low and aching. He breathed against it, not sure how to ease the deep unrest. His breath came in uneven bursts as he took one finger and lightly touched the little cheek. "He's amazing," he breathed. His eyes lifted, and they met Dusty's. She looked at him like he'd turned into a pile of gold right before her eyes, and she wasn't sure what to think or do. They stared at each other for a long moment over the bundle in his arms, before the baby stirred and began to make little mewing noises. "I think he needs his mama," Roland said. Dusty stepped forward, and Roland handed the baby off just as reverently as he'd gotten him. A tiny little human. Amazing. They left soon afterward. Roland was still in somewhat of a daze, never having held a baby of any type before. He'd been unprepared for the depth of emotion that had stirred in his soul. As it shifted and settled, his thoughts turned more and more to Dusty and what it might be like to share that with her. Thoughts he was pretty sure would make her run screaming away from him if she had any inkling he was thinking them. So he pressed down tight on his heart and tried to find the person he was before he walked into that maternity room. At the elevator, she pressed the button. As they waited, her small hand slipped into his. He turned, surprised. "Are you okay?" she asked, her brows tilted down. Yes, of course. Why?" His stammered answer only caused her face to pinch tighter. "Are you having chest pain?" No. Why?" "You have your hand over your heart." Roland looked down. Yep, his hand was resting over his heart like he was watching the flag go by at a parade. He shoved the offending appendage into his pocket. "That better?" "Why are you acting so weird?" He had to change the subject. "You want to go boating?" Man, he was dumb. Where did that idea come from? "Sure, I didn't know you had a boat," Dusty said as the elevator doors opened. "I don't, actually." Ben stepped off the elevator, carrying a bag and 2 waters. He stopped mid-stride, his eyes on their joined hands. When he looked back at Roland, there was a smirk on his face. Roland lifted his chin, and Ben's smirk got bigger. He might have snorted. "Your son is adorable," Dusty said. She tugged on Roland's hand, and they walked into the elevator. "Thanks," Ben said. They could hear him laughing as the elevator door closed. "What was so funny?" Dusty asked. Roland held up their joined hands. "Before he left, I told him we were friends. He found it funny then and even funnier now." Dusty nodded. "I see." Their hands dropped between them. "Are we going boating?" "We can. I have a buddy who has a boat. He borrows my lawnmower all the time, so I'm sure he'll let me use his boat. We can take it out on the river." Roland felt like he'd semi-recovered. As long as they didn't see any more babies, he should be back to normal soon. He did make a mental note to never visit another newborn in the hospital. Hi, this is Jay, and thanks for listening. If you're ready for another great audiobook, here's one we think you might like. Or check out the playlist with all our latest releases. Don't forget to subscribe to Say with Jay, give this video a thumbs up, and tell us what you liked in the comments.